can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I feel like 100 grand.
You are listening to Inspired Insider with your host, Dr. Jeremy Wise.
Dr. Jeremy Wise here, founder of InspiredInsider.com, where I talk with inspirational entrepreneurs and leaders. Today is no different. I am going to introduce today's guest in a second, Bobby Achettu of Accelerated Growth. And this will also go on the Rising Entrepreneurs podcast, where we feature amazing entrepreneurs who are in EO, which is Entrepreneurs Organization. And Bobby is the president of the Chicago chapter. Bobby, I always like to mention other guests people should check out on the podcast. So I've had some amazing EO people, Becky Galvez, Candor Threads, Winnie Hart of Twin Engine, Ayalap Shaw of 108.agency, and Zach Wilcox of Fied Freight, and many more. So check those out. It's a treasure trove of information and stories. And before I introduce Bobby, this episode is brought to you by Rise 25. And at Rise 25, we help businesses give to and connect to their Dream 100 relationships. And how do we do that? We help you run your podcast. For me, so essentially, we are an easy button for a company to launch and run your podcast. And for me, probably the number one thing in my life is relationships. I'm always looking at ways to give to my best relationships. And I found no better way to do that than to profile the people and companies I most admire on this planet and profile them on my podcast. So if you've thought about podcasting and you have a business, you should. If you have questions, go to rise25.com. You can email us anytime. Both my business partner, John Corcoran, who's also in EO San Francisco, you can email us. We've both been doing this for over a decade. So support at rise25.com. And I'm excited to introduce Bobby Achettu. He's the CEO of Accelerated Growth. Accelerated Growth is an accounting, finance, and technology consulting firm based in Chicago. And he's grown the organization to 130 team members and has led the company to 4 consecutive appearances on the Inc. 5000 list. And in addition, if he's not busy enough, he's president of EO Chicago, also an adjunct professor at Northwestern University, where he teaches on the evolution of modern business, and AG partners with companies who have made it out of their startup phase, and they're working on their second stage of growth. So it's typically between $3 million and $300 million in revenue. Bobby, thanks for joining me.
It's an absolute pleasure, Jeremy. Thank you for having me. I'm humbled by the list of names that you spoke about earlier, so I'm hoping that I could fill their shoes.
It's not easy to be a leader and then being a leader among leaders. What made you decide to take on the role of the president of EO for Chicago?
Great question. So there were really 2 things. So first and foremost, I've been a member for 8 years. And the Entrepreneurs Organization has absolutely transformed my life, both personally and professionally. The impact that it's had on my business, it's very clear from relationships that I've built and learnings that I've gotten. And then on the personal side, just the life of entrepreneur is a very difficult one for not just the entrepreneur themselves, but everyone they surround themselves with, right? And so from that perspective, I felt a compelling need to give back to the organization. But the other reason I did it is what people don't recognize is being on the board of the Entrepreneurs Organization, especially here in Chicago, affords you the opportunity to surround yourself with some amazing entrepreneurs that are extremely passionate about the same organization that you are. And so I think one of the phrases that I heard described being on the board is, imagine working with a group of people that you would never be able to hire. And ultimately, I get the opportunity to lead a group of people that I would never be able to hire. And what I'm realizing as I go through this presidency is this may be one of the best teams that I ever worked with in my career. So I'm 2 months into my presidency, and I'm legitimately starting to think about the fact that I only have 10 months left of this, right? And so I've been having an absolute blast. It is obviously a lot of work, but it's something that I'm extremely passionate about and am happy to do every day.
I want to hear about some of your mentors in EO and some of the lessons that you learned from them. And we will talk about why even entrepreneurship. I know you led a successful career for 12 years in corporate, and then you took the leap I feel like if that was me, I'd be like, forget it. Like, why, I remember visiting someone at LinkedIn and they had a full like cafeteria, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I'm like, I would never leave this place. Right. So start off with EO and some of the mentors and lessons you learned. We'll circle back to your corporate career.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, there's too many to name, so I can give you some themes, right? So first and foremost, what I learned in EO is that oftentimes stepping away from your business and allowing yourself some breathing room actually creates opportunity to grow the business. In fact, when I first joined EO, one of my biggest fears was how was I going to step away for a day to go to forum, or a half day, whatever it was at the time. How can I attend an event that started at noon and went on until 6 p.m.? And I remember the anxiousness as I got to these different events and forum meetings, thinking, well, what's going to happen with my business? And eventually, what I realized very quickly is, giving people in your organization the opportunity to really operate and run on their own ultimately is in the best interest of not just the company, but also of yourself, right? And so that was a huge key learning. The other learning that I'm still working through is this concept of balance and the importance of balancing both your personal and professional lives. In fact, a lot of times we focus, depending on the forum meeting and the topic, we'll focus on that aspect, which I think a lot of other organizations don't necessarily do. So, the short answer, Jeremy, is there's so many ways that EO has impacted my life, and there's so many mentors that I've had that have given me from the small snippets of guidance and direction to the big, life-changing strategic ones.
I know when your parents came over to the US, they started with practically nothing, and it was looked at as success to get a core position. You stay there for a long time, that stability. And I was listening to you talk about, there was one time where you went in to restructure a bank and your vision of stability shifted. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is interesting, as working at one of the largest professional services firms in the world at a multi-billion-dollar bank. And all throughout my childhood, my parents encouraged me to work at large corporate organizations for that perceived safety. And when I worked turnaround and restructuring, what I realized is actually working at a large company, in my opinion, is oftentimes riskier than working at a small company. And the reason is, when I went into this particular bank, we looked at the payroll register, we looked at titles, we looked at tenure, and we made very quick decisions based on just spreadsheets. And of course, there were a handful of people that the senior executives were effectively saying, okay, not those people. But if you didn't get that level of protection for whatever reason that they got that protection, you were just, eventually a statistic. And, so a data point that I'm not proud of, but, I'll call out is, when I worked that job, I was responsible for many people losing their jobs in situations where ultimately there weren't a lot of choices to be made for those companies. But a lot of times those changes, those job losses were made in a fashion that there was very little control for that individual. Whereas as an entrepreneurial company, you can really make yourself, just so valuable to that organization that it becomes really hard for them to get rid of you.
Anyone who knows you knows you're a very heart-centered person. And so I don't want to make it out like you're heartless, just firing people. I mean, it was for the sake of saving that company and saving other people's jobs. But, what was interesting when you tell those stories is that company in particular was losing a lot of money. I don't recall what you had said, but millions, tens of millions of dollars every year. And, you saw firsthand that even billion-dollar companies can have the struggles of startups too, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
What were you doing when you went into these turnaround and restructuring to help?
So first and foremost, there's the concept of stopping the bleeding, right? And oftentimes it's not as easy as just looking at spreadsheets. There's a lot of conversations to understand the strategy of the organization. But then ultimately you have to dig in and work through the spreadsheets and get your hand dirty get your hands dirty to understand actually what's going on. And in the midst of all that, often you're very limited on time. Oftentimes these companies have just a few weeks or months to be able to execute some pretty dramatic changes. So it's a very intense, high pressure environment that now today, what I share with the clients that we work with, these high growth entrepreneurial organizations, is in many ways, whether you're in a period of turnaround or a period of hyper growth, you need to look at the business the same way. The entrepreneurial organizations are fragile and they need to be managed, and there need to be metrics and data that are consistently measured, because at any given point, based on economic indicators, what's happening in the environment, things can change. And so that's what we encourage our clients to always be hyper focused.
Like right now, I mean, there's always something in the climate, whether it's COVID or interest rates or something, your clients come to you saying, how do I prepare? Right. So right now in this state, whenever someone's listening to this, whether it's 6 months, a year, 2 years, what are the conversations you're having with your clients now about preparing?
Yeah. So first and foremost, we talk about really making sure that from a cash flow and planning perspective, that there are processes in place. And so oftentimes people only institute these measures when they're in the midst of a crisis. And that is absolutely not the time that you want to be focused on building some of this infrastructure, right? So making sure that there's mechanisms in place to be able to track the performance of your business on a fairly a quick basis, right? Secondly, there needs to be, in this environment especially, a hyper focus on your customer and your team. Obviously, it's a tremendously competitive hiring environment. So talking to your team and making sure that they're getting the development, career progression, compensation, whatever it may be, that is critical. And then talking to your customers to make sure, from the perspective of not just the standard scope and timing and fees and all of those types of things, but what are the true issues within their business and how can you help solve those issues? Those relationships are ultimately what drive most organizations to succeed or fail. And so doubling down on the ability to build those relationships, I think, is really critical.
When you say making quick decisions, knowing cash flow, having mechanisms in place, what are some of the things that you recommend? Someone's listening right now. Are you helping people build out certain dashboards? What should people be thinking about when they hear you say that?
Yeah, absolutely. It starts with a simple cash flow tool. You can think about your accounts receivable, when you expect payment on that accounts receivable. Think about major expenses like payroll or cost of goods sold, estimating those items and starting a process by which to build out a tool. And there's certainly software out there as well that can assist you with this. But creating that structure around the recurrence of seeing that type of information, oftentimes really that alone can drive decision making, because you'll see things that ultimately you may not see as you really focus on running the business, the day-to-day tactical side of things. So ultimately, we always say start with that baseline cash flow tool.
So Bobby, you had a client, and you have a lot of clients in the technology space. This one in particular, technology and advertising. Talk about when they came to you, what was going on and what you ended up doing with them.
Absolutely. So this particular organization is in hyper-growth mode, had been looked at by several potential acquirers, but ultimately hadn't invested in the early years around finance and accounting. And so as organizations look to due diligence, this company realized that they wouldn't be able to get through a process because they didn't have the right data and information. And I don't mean just financial statements. I'm talking about customer retention and those types of things, right? There was an entire infrastructure layer missing, but with a really interesting and compelling strategy for an acquirer, right? And so we engaged this organization about 6 months before they raised capital and instituted a process by which we created that reporting infrastructure from both the accounting and finance side and the technology side, until ultimately they were in a position where they were able to hire an investment banker, begin a process, and then ended up ultimately taking on investment from a strategic.
When do companies typically call you? I could see these inflections of they're raising capital, they're selling. What are those times when you get that phone call?
Yeah. So prospects typically call when something's going really well or something's going really bad. those are the scenarios. And so the really bad often is when they've lost a key finance person. They've been turned down, by an investor or a bank or something like that because they didn't have the right reporting. And then the flip side of it is when they're, as in the example of this particular technology company, where there's a tremendous opportunity in front of them and they want to make sure that they're positioned in the best manner and they have the right information to make decisions. So it's typically at those key inflection points.
When that company comes to you, what's the first few things you do with them?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first piece of it, and, really a phrase that we use in EO all the time is experience share. Ultimately, we have a unique perspective. We've worked with over 300 companies in multiple different industries. So we've seen a lot of things, Jeremy. And so starting with that experience share, I found always to be valuable. Secondly, if we believe there's an opportunity to help, we have a process that we call accelerated insights. So that's where effectively we perform a diligence on the organization. Depending on the size and industry of the company, oftentimes we'll spend anywhere from 20 to 60 hours actually digging into the organization, reviewing financials, reviewing operating metrics, logging into financial and operational systems. We'll take that time to really understand what the issues are. And the beauty of that process is it really only takes a few hours from the prospect side. We're investing the time up front so that we can really properly understand what the issues are. The reality is, Jeremy, that the space that we work within can be very dangerous to jump in to a client situation and not truly understand what the issues are and what the needs are.
So you complete the 60 hours of research. Are you giving them updates throughout? Or is it one presentation at the end? How does it work to present that?
Yeah,
the findings?
Great question. And again, anywhere from 20 to 60, and the 60 would be a really significant scenario, right? And so we produce an accelerated insights report, and effectively, this is a document that allows this organization, irrespective of whether they engage us or not, to understand where they fall within the life cycle of maturity of their finance, accounting, and technology function, right? So there's some benchmarking, let's call it, that really helps them understand where they fall relative to best practices. And then in that document, if we believe there's a way that we can help, then we'll include scope, timing, and fees. So there's a presentation that we do to prospects on that matter.
So I don't know if the best example would be the technology company or maybe the CPG, but I'm curious, once you presented this, the insights, what decisions have you seen that were made? Because I'm sure just from that's really valuable for a company. What have you seen decisions that are made just from presenting those insights?
Yeah, so oftentimes, we'll find scenarios where there's been, incorrect assumptions made on, certain analyses that were put together. We've run into scenarios where we say, listen, you don't need to engage us. You need something much more compelling from the perspective of you need to raise capital because you don't see what's 2 or 3 months ahead of you, and we do, right? And so oftentimes having that external perspective can become invaluable because far too often as entrepreneurs and leadership teams in entrepreneurial companies, we spend so much time executing the day-to-day that we don't have the ability to step back and really understand the broader picture.
So sometimes people realize they have to raise capital and they weren't thinking of it. Does it ever happen the reverse where they were going to raise capital and they decided against it because of the insights? Or
absolutely, and part of that is going to be dependent on what's happening in the environment as far as the economy and deal structuring and valuations and all those types of things, right? And so certainly there have been scenarios where companies and oftentimes people think that they have to raise, and the reality is sometimes it's more prudent to wait, become stable, understand your business model, and then go out and raise.
And, I know you help a wide variety of companies. You help CPG companies too. So I'm wondering if you could walk us through a scenario where you helped a CPG company.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we have quite a bit of experience in CPG, probably about 35% or so of our client base is in that industry. And it's, very complex, hyper competitive. I was at Expo West a while back, and
I've always wanted to go to Expo West just for the samples.
Yeah, absolutely. The samples are great. Thousands of companies. And, the reality is, as you look across this huge conference hall, there's actually several conference halls, you realize that the vast majority of those companies won't exist in the next couple of years, right? And so hyper competitive. And then you have, just relatively complex analyses and things that have to be executed, and things like trade spend and slotting fees and just a lot of things that have to be incorporated. And so with the CPG industry specifically, we've got that expertise, just having worked with some of the hyper growth companies here in town and seeing their evolution, right? And so one in particular, we joined when they were a couple million in revenue, went through this insights process with them. There were a couple people in the organization at the time. One of the founders was handling the day-to-day accounting. We took that over. They grew substantially, eventually exited to a strategic. It got to the point where they were well over 100 million in revenue. And ultimately, we ended up not only executing the finance and accounting function in the early days, but building out process. And as they hired individuals to join their team full time, we actually would train them and ramp them up. We helped with a lot of the diligence related to the transaction, and then ended up continuing to work with the strategic buyer afterwards on the finance accounting side. And so it was a full life cycle of opportunities for us, and then also really an exciting scenario to be part of, to see an organization through their entire journey.
So it sounds like you help, in this growth phase, there's probably a lot of phases within that growth phase, but it seems like you also bridge some of those gaps. So maybe you were acting as like a fractional, like CFO team. And then once they hired someone and they grew enough to hire someone, then you would help train that person up and do other roles.
Yep. So that was, yeah, absolutely. It's interesting now as we've grown as an organization, I would say probably about 75% of the work that we do is actually for the CFO. So, the vast majority of companies we work for now have built up finance functions. And certainly, we do work in scenarios where that's not the case. But we've now, really moved upstream as far as the size of organizations that we work with for a multitude of reasons. And so, we have the ability to do both, but in most cases now we work for the CFO.
How would CFOs describe what you do? Like, how would they say they make my job easier because, or what do they say?
Yeah, absolutely. It's for us, Jeremy, the way a CFO would describe is it's not just about execution, it's about creating structure and process. And ultimately, a lot of times, especially with internal finance and accounting teams, they're running around so much and they haven't necessarily seen the hundreds of companies that we have. So it's very hard for them to stop and create process. For accelerated growth, our key premise, the foundation of our organization is that as an entrepreneurial company scales, they need to have structure and process within every functional area of the business. And accounting and finance and technology is what ties all the functional areas of a business together. And so that's where we see ourselves as having a critical role, not just to execute, but to ensure that that foundation is strong for these companies.
So, Bobby, you're in corporate for 12 years. And then what made you decide to start your own company?
Yeah, great question. And here's what I'd say is I really enjoyed working in corporate. I worked at some really great companies, had great leaders that I reported to and learned a ton. So I am not one of these entrepreneurs that, felt like I was unemployable or I couldn't work at a big company. Ultimately, I had an opportunity to work at a private equity firm after I left a large professional services organization. So that was my first exposure to the entrepreneurial space. I went from being, one of 200,000 employees to being employee number 6. And I just fell in love with the space immediately. The passion, the vision, the ability to have an impact. And I also saw very clearly the need for what I described earlier, that infrastructure as an organization scales. And because I got bit by the entrepreneurial bug, working with all these entrepreneurs, I came up with the concept of accelerated growth.
Talk about your first client and how you got them.
Yeah, so I was still at the PE firm, and I was out to dinner with one of the vendors of the PE firm. And as I was talking to this particular gentleman, I talked him through what would eventually become accelerated growth, this concept of infrastructure with a focus on accounting, finance, and technology. And he basically said, listen, I need that service. So if you ever actually start that company, And so within a couple of months, I engaged him. I left the private equity firm. They became our first client. At the time, they had about 50, 60 employees. We worked with them for about 5-6 years. At that point, they had something like 500, and they're currently, well over 1,000 at this point. And so, just a great story arc there, and learned a tremendous amount. And the way I describe it, I joke with the CEO, I was hanging on for dear life, trying not to screw anything up. And really, that was, by the way, Jeremy, that was the first 2 to 3 years. It was me and a couple contractors. I wouldn't even say it was barely a business back then. It was more something I really just enjoyed. I was passionate about. So it wasn't until about probably 10 years ago that I started hiring and building scale within my own organization.
Bobby, I don't know what your family life was like around that time, but I imagine there were some discussions around, doing that and starting that company and leaving the position in the private equity and corporate. What was the discussion like with you and family members?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'll say my wife, Julie, has been just always supportive of my passions and my career. And ultimately, I spent a dozen years in these large corporate environments, and though I really enjoyed working at in these scenarios, I wanted to have something that I felt just much more tangible impact. And so ultimately, Julie and the rest of my family has always been focused on the fact that if I'm enjoying what I do, I can have significant impact. And so those were the driving conversations. There were really not that many conversations about risk or any of those types of things. I think there was a lot of confidence in my ability to execute on whatever I put together. And so, yeah, again, the focus really on happiness.
Talk about growing the team and building a team, because you said it was you and a couple of contractors. What were some of the key team members that you hired throughout the journey? Because now you're over, 100 people. Yeah,
there's so many key folks, especially in the early days. And, I remember one gentleman in particular, JP Tucker, one of my first hires, had worked at Deloitte for several years. And so I remember at the time we didn't have an office. We were just about to move into an office. So I interviewed him at one of our clients' conference rooms, and just an incredible discussion. And I remember, and I told him this a few months after the fact, I remember thinking, wow, to have someone of this caliber and background join effectively a solopreneur at the time, I was really humbled. Right. And always appreciative of those folks in the early days that recognize something, not just in our organization, but frankly, in me, that gave them the confidence to leave, great organizations to come be part of my journey. Right. And so, there have been many of those folks at various stages of the life cycle, right, that have been key contributors as we've grown the organization.
What about from a position standpoint? Like early on, what were the positions you're looking for? And as you grew, what positions did you bring on, or maybe people grew up within the organization? Yeah, so it's really fascinating, being the CEO of a services firm and having worked with scores of services organizations. What I found is there's various iterations of service businesses. And for me, and in my industry,
when we were 1 to 10, I was still doing billable work. So I was heads down, really focused on clients. I remember those times really fondly because we're all in the same office, working together. I knew everything that was going on every client. I knew every situation, everything good, everything bad. As we grew past the 10 mark, that's when I started having the ability to actually lead the team versus execute. And then when we got to about 25, that's when I had other key folks in the organization that were also non-billable, that were focused on leading the organization. When we got to about 50 is when we had the ability to build out a full leadership team, right? And so those different iterations allowed for me to elevate within my role, and also, I believe, help drive the growth of the organization as a whole.
Bobby, in that kind of 26 to 50 where you brought on other leaders, what were the positions? Because again, you had, I don't know, advantage is the right word, but you grew up in these large organizations. So if someone's just starting from scratch, entrepreneur, they may not even be familiar with the structure and the leadership that is in a larger corporation. So whether it was conscious or unconscious, like you had that background. Who were some of the first leaders that you're like, okay, I need to step out of even leading and bring in other leaders?
So, it's fascinating as we talk about this. I didn't hire very many people from the outside in leadership positions. Most of the folks on my team have grown up organically within the organization. And so that's been a driver of our growth, I'd say, is to really focus on the development of our team. Certainly, we've had folks come in at a senior level from the outside, but ultimately, we want to make sure that the folks in our company have the ability and opportunity to be able to elevate and grow into roles, right? Which I think has been key to our success.
So, Bobby, you don't have to name names. I'm curious if you look at, COO, and you think back to where they started. Where did they start, and then what were the positions that they worked at along the way?
Sure, absolutely. So we have we follow EOS in our company, and so we have a gentleman that has the title of integrator, so effectively the equivalent of a COO. And so he joined us. He has a background in technology. We have a technology practice, so he joined us as someone doing client work on the delivery side. But he very quickly proved himself to not only be an incredible operator and technologist, but also just a great manager of people, a great mentor, a great servant leader, right? And so, very quickly we elevated him into not just a overarching management role, but eventually we put him in the position to be integrator, where in that capacity, all the different businesses, the business units report up into him.
And then, so kind of just grew from the client work on up.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And then, at what point did you bring on kind of a board?
Oh, great question. So it was in the early days. Informally, it was, I would say, from almost day one. I had a board, and I formalized the board probably 6 years ago. And interestingly, it was right around the time we were, probably 10 or 12 people. And so I don't think it's any coincidence that when I formalized the board and really started to build a cadence around that governance, that all of a sudden our organization really began to grow. I'm the sole founder of the company. And so it's a lonely place to be, right? And so having the guidance and direction of the two gentlemen on my board has been absolutely amazing.
How do you navigate international? Because you have staff all over the U.S. and international as well.
Yeah, so we have offices in India, and it's interesting. Though we're a relatively small company in the scheme of things, the fact that we operate on two different continents obviously complicates things. And I'm not just referencing, time zones or things like that. Ultimately, there are two different cultures in India and the United States, but we're trying to maintain a unified culture as an organization. And that's not easy to do. And ultimately, there's always going to be some differences. But what we really focus on is our core values, our vision, and our mission. And those concepts are ultimately universal. And that's what we really ensure is embedded within the organization as a whole, and everyone understands what our core values, our vision and mission are.
I mean, I'm wondering, from a culture perspective, what do you do to help maintain culture across the continents, to help create the cohesiveness? I mean, I've seen videos of you actually get, people come together in person. What are some things you do, maybe virtually and in person, that help with the culture?
It's all about communication, Jeremy, in my opinion. And so, that and interaction, making sure people are consistently interacting with each other. And so when we first started our offices in India a little over 3 years ago, it was interesting. We had a couple team members there, but there was one point where we had 3 people from the US that had traveled to India to train 2 team members, right? So we've always been heavy on the travel back and forth. Obviously with COVID that stopped. But just as an example, I leave tomorrow for my second trip to India of the year. And so that interaction and camaraderie is really important. In addition, we have fairly consistent global team meetings where the entire organization gets together. We have a section of the agenda, both local office and globally, that we call Empower Thought. And so that's effectively our mechanism for team members to ask any questions on any topic. We have an anonymous question submission tool that we use, and I answer questions without knowing what the questions are going to be. I answer them just off the cuff, right? Because I want to make sure people have the ability to get my raw reaction to whatever their question may be. So that's just one example of many ways that try to create a inclusive, welcoming environment where people feel comfortable really being themselves.
That's the Empower Thought.
Yeah, that's right.
And how often is that?
So each local office does it twice a month, and then globally we meet once a month.
And then
in
is
fact,
it?
I'll call out.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I was going to say, I'll call out that, so Empower Thought is one section in a meeting that we call Friday Forum. And I call it Friday Forum because EO has this concept of forum groups where you get together with other folks, typically 8 to 10 people, and you experience share, right? And so ultimately, I wanted to replicate that dynamic within my organization. So we meet on Fridays under this concept called Friday Forum, and one of the sections is Empower Thought.
Do you remember any tough questions that you got?
I've gotten many. In fact, what I'll do is if people don't have questions, I don't pick on them, but I'll actually pause and wait for a question to be asked before I'll end the meeting, right? And so, I've gotten questions, from a spectrum of, compensation planning and how do we go about that, all the way to, what my favorite color is if somebody's struggling with asking a question, right? So, really trying to create that environment where, we encourage that. And in fact, every month we get a prize for the best Empower Thought question, right?
Bobby, I want to just thank you for what you do at Accelerated Growth, what you do at EO, EO Chicago and EO in general, because there's nothing that can replace getting together with like-minded people and sharing. So thank you. I encourage everyone to check out acceleratedgrowth.com. And you can also check out EO. And if you're in EO Chicago, check out EO Chicago. Bobby, thanks for joining me.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Jeremy. Thank you for having me.
What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sailing right now. I'm feeling like 100 grand.